So I've had a request come in via the comments to share some thoughts on Ericksonian stories. So I'm assuming most people know what that refers to. Milton Erickson, as part of his approach to hypnosis, would often tell people stories, often in a hypnotic way. There's an argument that could be made that all stories are hypnotic. They draw people in, they create absorption, and that this is a powerful mind-shifting technique. I happen to agree with this, but I want to give a little bit more on this topic and offer a few contrasts that will help make sense of this. So first thing I want to share quickly is a distinction between diagnostic work and dialogic work. Okay. Now, diagnostic work is simply you look at what's going on, or you listen to the client and you come up with a diagnosis as to what is off, what is wrong, how are the gears crunching here rather than meshing. And then you offer a solution, okay? Or you take somebody through a process that creates a solution in alignment with how you have diagnosed things. I'll give an example of this in just a moment. A dialogic approach is different. A dialogic approach doesn't diagnose at all. A dialogic approach just engages in a co-creation with the client. There's a back and forth, and difference unfolds from that. And if we take that idea that somebody's unconscious mind is powerful, adaptive, has all the resources it needs, as we engage in this co-creation, the approach or the solution that gets created that unfolds from it is generally pretty healthy and generally pretty ecological. So I really like working this way. I like working dialogically and have a bias towards working dialogically, but I also work diagnostically. And I want to point out that whilst these things can be in conflict, they are not necessarily in conflict, okay? So if you diagnose and you have an idea, right, this is what's going on, and I think this is a good way of treating this, so long as you hold that with a loose enough grip, you can then bring that into a dialogic process, okay, which actually enables the solution to adapt and really come alive in a unique way for the client. So diagnostic information can inform dialogue, but you don't need diagnostic information to work dialogically. So I want to give a couple of examples here of in action or in practice what the difference between diagnostic and dialogic might be. So one of the best examples of working dialogically is working with Grovian Clean Language. Now, the aim with Grovian Clean Language is you are facilitating a very psychoactive process with somebody, but you're keeping your presuppositions to a real minimum, okay? And this is to create as much space as possible for the client to connect with what's relevant to them without any outside imposition of ideas. And you as the facilitator, yes, you're helping people connect to what they have within them, but your job is to help to reweave it in different ways and maybe blow on various embers and so they can catch light, but it's very much driven by what comes out from the client. Now, in this kind of work, metaphors emerge, but they emerge from the client, and they're usually simple metaphors, not complex metaphors. Like somebody might say, well, it was like, like a knife in my heart or something like that. Or they might say, when I feel that freedom, I feel like an eagle soaring above a canyon or something like this. So the metaphors that come out tend to come out from the client. So this is very dialogic, as in it's a backwards and forwards, it's a co-creation. When I'm doing this kind of work, which I never do purely, but it's worth practicing purely, and I'm just there to weave together in different ways, or to encourage a weaving together in different ways, what is coming out from the client. However, I also work diagnostically. Now, let me give you an example of working diagnostically. I worked with a client recently who was deeply upset by a family situation, right? Things had been said, and he was feeling that it was unjust and it was unfair, and basically that he personally had been wronged. He was taking it very personally. Now, listen to me saying that. He was taking it very personally. That's me diagnosing, right? My diagnosis of the situation is he was making all sorts of meanings out of what had been said that were potentially saying things about him. And nobody wants to be in the wrong. There's a line I often use with people, which relates to the song, "Oh Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood." A lot of people suffer from that. They cannot be comfortable with being misunderstood. Why is that? Well, they cannot be comfortable being misunderstood because deep down, they don't have that strong certainty or strong sense of self under the surface that says, no, actually, this is the way it is. So they're being led into doubt, led into cognitive dissonance when they are misunderstood, and they feel threatened. Now, all of that hypothesis I just gave, that's all diagnosis. Is it true? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe it's closer to the truth. I'm basically running diagnosis based on models. I've worked with clients for a long, long time. I've built up a lot of models in my mind as to problem patterns and how problems form, what kind of binds, what kind of internal binds there are. And I immediately go, right, I think I see a pattern here. If that pattern was to dissolve, that will be extremely useful. Now, this is where, for me, I often work with kind of Ericksonian style metaphors or storytelling. Now, an Ericksonian metaphor is basically a story. A clean language metaphor is a much simpler actual type metaphor. So to give an example, one of the things that I did with this particular client was I told the story of the scorpion and the turtle, okay? And the story of the scorpion and the turtle, if you don't know it, goes like this. I'm not going to do this in a particularly hypnotic way because this is not a hypnosis session right now. And I just want to get this information across. So I'm just giving you the story, not necessarily how I would deliver the story. There's a hypnotic delivery to stories that's worth being aware that will be there. So the story of the scorpion and the turtle is simply this. One day there was a turtle at the edge of a river, and he was minding his own business, and a scorpion showed up and said, "Excuse me, I wonder if you could help me. I need to get across to the other side of the river, but I can't swim. Would it be possible for me to ride across the river on your back? If you could swim across, I could ride across on your back." Now the turtle says, "What, are you crazy? I'm not going to let you ride on my back. You're a scorpion, You'll just sting me and then I'll die. Why would I take that risk? Why would I take that chance?" The scorpion says, "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous. Why on earth would I sting you? I mean, if I got on your back and we were halfway across the river and I stung you, you became paralyzed and died, you would die, but I would die too because I would drown, right? That would be crazy. Why would I sting you?" Now, the turtle thinks, well, that makes sense, actually. That's pretty logical. And he's a good-hearted character, so the turtle says, "Okay, hop on, I'll take you across." Halfway across the river, he feels this burning pain in the back of his neck. Suddenly, and feels the paralyzing venom start to enter his system, and his breathing starts to shut down. And with his last gasps, he says to the scorpion, "Why? Why?" And the scorpion says, "Because I'm a scorpion." Okay? Now, I told this story, and I told many other stories, other metaphors I used with this client. I said, when you're handling a cactus, it's worth being aware of the nature of a cactus. There's nothing wrong with a cactus, but you need to be a bit careful when you handle a cactus because they're prickly. I said, particularly those ones, I used to have these ones when I was a kid with little hooks in, and they were terrible. They get hooked in the skin of your fingers. You had to be very careful if you're handling them. But absolutely beautiful. I used to love having these cacti. So there's all sorts of metaphors that I'm sharing, and these are just a couple that I shared with this client, around not taking things personally, recognizing that things have a nature, and that nature isn't necessarily about you. Okay? So this was based on a diagnosis as to how he was creating this problem, how he was holding it in place, how he was creating his upset, because the issue was the upset that he was experiencing, the upset that he was creating. And of course, another aspect to it was the fact that the family members he'd had the disagreement, the fallout with, who had said things that he had found hurtful, did not want to sit down and discuss the matter. They didn't want to discuss it. Right? So I also shared various other metaphors around people's personal sovereignty and their choices, and how you cannot make people do things that they're not ready to do. Now, I also did dialogic work with him as well, but this was dialogic because what I'm doing, I'm diagnosing and I'm coming up with these metaphors based upon a diagnosis, but then I'm feeding them in to a co-creative dialogue. I'm not there trying to force the client to get the point. That isn't the aim of the game. I'm there just to seed the ideas. Now, when I'm working this way, I am watching for shifts. I am watching for responses. I'm still running dialogically. So I might say later on in the session, I might say, so I'm curious, what are you seeing now, or what are you aware of now that's different from before we began this conversation today? Right? And I'll get feedback from that because I want to be calibrating and I want to be maturing any changes that are unfolding. As it happened, this guy got a huge amount of resolution from this session and the follow-up session. I did 2 sessions with him in the main, and I did a 3rd session actually, but there really was nothing that needed to be done in the 3rd session at all. He was in a really good place. Before the work, he'd been upset, he'd been agitated, he'd been unable to sleep, he was having intrusive thoughts about this all day. It was starting to affect his relationship with his wife. He was really hooked into this system. Afterwards, he was sleeping fine. He was at peace with it. He'd really given the people permission to be as they are and do as they are. And he was feeling very good about himself in terms of his ability to manage the situation, to create change, and was feeling good about the person he was becoming, because he very much saw himself as becoming somebody different. And that part of the issue now in his mind, after we'd done the work, was that people in his family were resistant to the changes he was making that he valued. So it was a big shift, and a lot of that was done through a kind of Ericksonian storytelling approach. So there's real value in that approach. It really can move minds. One last thing I'll just say about this. The difference that makes the difference often as to whether a particular story is going to land or move somebody's mind or whatever is the degree to which they are open to the messages within it. My old mentor, Steve Chandler, used to say, when the mind is open, it will shift. One of the good things about working in a more kind of clean language way, or maybe in a more strictly dialogic way, where you're drawing resources out of the client or reweaving what they've got, is you get much, much lower levels of resistance in people because people are always entranced or enamored by their own materials. If you're offering a story that comes from the outside, some people can be more resistant to that. But it isn't inevitable. If you've got someone who's very resistant to outside offered information, it's much more useful to work in a more purely dialogic way, evoking resources from within and encouraging the client to make their own connections. People tend to have very low levels of resistance for that. But if somebody is very open, they come in from a very open place, and they're curious about what you have to offer, what you have to bring, then storytelling work can be incredibly powerful, often is incredibly powerful. But the thing is to know why you're telling the story, okay? And this is something that has attempted to be addressed, I think, in some NLP books. I think Therapeutic Metaphors by David Gordon attempts to address this. But I think this is what I believe. I don't think you can get a formula that tells you how to diagnose the structure of a problem. I think understanding the structure of problems is something that you come to across time through working with clients. Obviously, that process can be accelerated by good mentoring and that kind of thing. I don't know of any good books that really show how to do that, because it's a reasonably complex thing. It's something you get a feel for across time. But there are certain typical structures, things like resistance, what you cannot be with will not let you be, personalizing things, taking them very personally. That's another huge thing. Taking one's thoughts too seriously, being caught in single perspectives. There's all sorts of things like this, doing what I call blocky renderings over fluid renderings. A blocky rendering is where something is absolute, right? Somebody might go, I am such an idiot. That's a very blocky way of rendering things. So once you start to be able to hear structures, hear how things are being held, what kind of psychological grip a problem is being held in, then the metaphor work becomes very, very useful. If you've just bought a book of Ericksonian stories and you're going to randomly tell them, I'm not going to say you're not going to get good results with that, because you might get good results. It's just a little bit more of a, I don't know, a bit more of a hit and miss process. But that's not a problem if you have good dialogic sensibilities and you can put the work inside of a dialogic, interactive, co-creative flow. So if this has been a useful session for you, please do give it the thumbs up. Please do give it some love. And if you've got friends who might benefit from this, please do share with your friends. Make sure you subscribe and make sure your friends subscribe to the channel. This is here as a resource for you.